Hi, Chris Mc Loone here with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this edition of our podcast. As you can see, I've got Andy Soccodato and Bill Adkins here today. They are both our rural water supply experts, but we're going to go off the water supply topic a little bit today and dive right into spec'ing a rig for the rural environment. You know, and when we talk about the rural environment, there are different challenges there, and often the rig will have to be designed to address those challenges. So, Andy and Bill, thank you very much for joining me again today to talk about this. Andy, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to move to you, Bill, because Bill, you're actually more, I think, working in the exact the two environments that I'm going to reference in the first question here. But Andy, is there much difference between a rig designed for rural operations than maybe one that's designed for urban and suburban?
Yeah. So, well, you know, it really, the cliche answer is it's going to depend on the needs of each fire department. Really, each fire department needs to, whether they're urban or rural, they really need to do a needs assessment and figure out what is it that they need their particular apparatus to do, and really have a hard, solid look and determine what the actual mission of the rig is. You know, typically in our rural environment, that mission is going to be more towards moving water, maybe even hauling water and doing it and accessing water from challenging places. Whereas on the urban side, depending on how big or small your urban fire department is, you might have a pumper that needs to do some pumper functions, engine company functions, but it may also have to cross over and do some, you know, light duty rescue or even truck company operations as well. So you might have a mix of a rescue style engine. That's not to say that your rural rig couldn't do the same, but for me personally, when we're looking at a rural engine, the priority really needs to be bringing water with you, being able to access water from rural sources, and having the equipment on board to move water efficiently.
Now, Bill, you see this every day. I mean, you're going to work in a more urban or suburban environment, and you're volunteering in a more rural environment. What are the differences you see between what you're using at work and what you're using on the volunteer side?
Mostly, like what Andy was saying, water. You know, my volunteer departments, we carry at least 1,000 gallons on an engine. Where at work, you know, it's 500 gallons or less. Sometimes, you know, we have a couple with 300 gallons. The big piece with, like what Andy was saying, is what is the purpose of that engine or that apparatus that you're dealing with? And it's not just about what your department has, it's what your mutual aid companies may be bringing. How long are you going to be sitting on the scene before the next due apparatus shows up? If it's multiple minutes, you may want something like a 2,000 gallon tank, something to give you that extra water for that stopping power on that rural fire.
It's interesting. Andy brought up the one thing, and I hadn't thought about that when I was putting this together for you guys, and that was that whole equipping for, you know, more, you know, choosing the mission. You know, where you had, you know, will you have you know, some, for example, some extrication tools on the truck, because when a lot of times, many times, not all the time, but I can think of where my wife is from. She's from northeastern Pennsylvania, just south of Binghamton, New York, right along the Susquehanna River. She also, but her hometown, Halstead, Pennsylvania, they respond, and most of the companies along that corridor respond to Route 81. Which is an interstate. So you really, you know, I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, but thank you for reminding me, Andy, because there are a lot of, there's a lot of, when you're talking about the mission of that truck, is it, and Halstead's kind of a good example, I think, as well. You know, there are no traffic lights, you know, so it's that kind of town, but it has that main drag where, you know, there are buildings on either side. And then, you know, once you get off that main road, it is kind of a grid. You know, you can go around the block, you know, for these houses. And the houses are typically pretty old, you know, various types of construction, various designs. But then where she was at was up a hill, was up a dirt road. So again, that's when you would get into a lot of that, into a lot of that water. But when you think about, the interstate that they're on, they respond to a lot of vehicle fires. They respond to a lot of vehicle accidents that require extrication. So that I think goes in line with what you were talking about, Andy, where, the mission of the truck is really going to rural or urban. It's the mission. It's the mission that makes the determination.
Yeah. It's always got to be mission first, right? Identify the mission and figure out what is this truck supposed to do? What is its job? And then figure out what it is from there, right? I know I've been to some fire departments where they have great staffing and they have the ability in a rural setting to have a pumper that is their first out and is set up more as a traditional urban engine with a low hose bed, multiple attack lines coming from multiple directions. But they have the staffing to also have their second rig set up as more of a wagon concept or a pumper tender or something that is going to haul water and be able to be more of a water supply piece. But other jurisdictions may not have that benefit of being blessed with staffing where they can really divide and conquer with the roles of their apparatus or have the funding to do that. But identifying the mission first is critical. And then throughout the spec process, holding that mission and making sure everybody knows what the mission is and always ground every decision back to what the mission is. And you can't go wrong on anything you build that way.
Yeah. In the suburban area, it's the same way. We have one heavy rescue at Lovell and Sims, but what happens when it's on another run? Our engines carry that extrication equipment as well. Something that you wouldn't see in an inner city necessarily.
Now, I just wanted to clarify as well. We're talking about rural rigs here. At least in my mind, we're talking about rural attack engines for, dwelling fires, maybe some commercial fires. And we're going to get into tanker tenders in just a second here, but we are not talking about wildland rigs. Although there are some wildland rigs that are set up these days to do some structural firefighting. We're talking about rural rigs built and designed for like an interior fire attack, not necessarily for wildland. Although I'm sure many of them will carry equipment for brush fires or some wild. I would call it light wildland, but just throw it out to you two. I'm not going off on too much of a tangent. I mean, that is a whole different ball game, right? When we're talking about wildland versus just equipping or designing a rural rig. Is that where you guys are coming from as well? Bill, I'll start with you on that one.
Wildland is something that I don't have a whole lot of experience with. I do know wildland is obviously rural, so they're going to need some water as well. However, they have to keep track of how heavy they become because they are going actually off-road a lot of times. And so I would imagine the equipment's going to be somewhat the same of what they are going to carry. It just may be in a different format on, where it is and what vehicles may carry that equipment. It may not come from the apparatus. Like they may have multiple apparatus showing up for that same mission. One carrying equipment, one carrying water. That's something that I really am not an expert in, or what I would consider myself.
But so we're on the same page there. We're not talking about the rigs that are like built for California wildfires. Yeah. We're talking about small town, very rural environments up in the hills. Typically they might not look that much different than an urban or a suburban pumper, but are tweaked a little bit to address those areas. Speaking of that, I wanted to talk a bit about spec'ing a rural pumper versus a rural tanker, and that could actually get me into a little bit of trouble too, because we do have a lot of those pumper tankers that are designed, for I guess to at least, get an interior attack off the ground. Some of them carry 1,000 gallons. The only difference is that, they're a tandem axle versus a single axle, but it's still a custom looking cab. Whereas a lot of tankers though do go with the commercial cab and chassis. as the choice. So talk to me a little bit about spec'ing a rural pumper versus a rural tanker. And again, where I'm kind of thinking with this is there are suburbs that do run tankers but not because they're rural. It's more because they got to a certain point. Prince George's County is a good example. There's a lot of that area that isn't covered with hydrants, so they do need to bring the water with them. But that's a little different, I think, than a rural tanker where, not only are we bringing the water with us, but then we're getting into those tanker shuttles and a lot of the other stuff. So I'm sorry, I will be quiet now. Talk about rural pumper design versus rural tanker design. Andy, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah. So again, there's a lot that goes into it. You brought up, Chris, the difference between the commercial cab and the custom cab. I personally am a huge custom cab fan, but I also know that comes with an added price difference, and that's going to be more expensive. It's a more expensive option. But there are a couple of reasons why I tend to prefer the custom cab option. Number one is typically they have better crash ratings and safety ratings compared to their commercial counterparts. The other major advantage is maneuverability and turning because of how the axle is positioned in relation to the rest of the chassis. So they are going to be a little bit more maneuverable and easier to operate on some of our tighter streets and roads in the rural setting. And then there's the obvious advantage of most of your custom cabs, are going to be a little bit outfitted better for more firefighters in the back and seating capacity without extending your wheelbase to, stupid positions and stuff like that. That's not to say that you couldn't get a commercial cab with an extended cab, but that's going to really impact your wheelbase and have some negative impacts on the apparatus as a whole that you have to be considerate about. But the obvious is funding is going to be a big thing, and not everybody can afford the custom cab, and I totally understand that. But one thing that I really, when we're talking about commercial pumpers versus tenders or tankers, right? A pumper, in my mind, in the rural setting, needs to be able to get water from just about anywhere. So I'm really advocating personally that I want intakes on all four sides of the truck, front, rear, and both sides. All of those intakes should have valves to be able to receive water from any direction. Personally, one of the disadvantages of setting up and spec'ing a rear intake is going to be, depending on your truck manufacturer and everything like that, it could have some impact on your hose bed height and depending on what you're trying to do. So I typically tell people that's the one intake that I will make a concession on and omit if I need to. If it's more important to have a rear compartment that's unobstructed or a low hose bed or something like that, the rear intake is the one that I'll get rid of if I have to get rid of one. But the ability to have a front and two working side intakes is critical in my opinion, especially in the rural setting, because I can nose into a source. I can quickly get water established from a static source, and I don't have to take up a huge lane of traffic. Some people watching this might be against the front intake due to the cost and due to the bins and the plumbing. Depending on your truck manufacturer, those that I've talked to in my research, you're looking at between $10,000 and $15,000 for a front intake, depending on your manufacturer and what options you have. Which again, I wouldn't necessarily want to pay out of my pocket for that option, but considering that trucks today are close to the $1 million ballpark range, to me, a $15,000 option is a drop in the bucket for the functionality that it provides on the rural fireground. And I wouldn't trade that for anything personally. But the other big thing, the big disadvantage that people will talk about with front intakes is, the limitations on flow. And that's true. We have bins in the plumbing, and the plumbing does have to get over the front axle to get to the pump. And typically, depending on the configuration, you're looking at about 750 gallons a minute that you can achieve from a draft. Now, that's from a draft. That's a realistic flow. Some rigs can do 800, and I've pumped some trucks that'll do 1,000, but it really isn't how it's plumbed. But some folks will take a look and say, well, I can only get 750, and that's half my pump's capacity, so it's not worth it. Here's my my challenge to those folks. Think about it in terms of, fire flow on the fire ground. How often are we pulling up and needing from the beginning to initiate a fire attack of more than 750 gallons a minute at the fire scene? And if that is a common occurrence, my question to you is your use of the front intake the limiting factor, or do you have enough tankers in your shuttle route to keep up with a 750 plus gallon per minute flow rate at the fire scene? My bet, and in my experience, is typically I don't have enough tankers in the beginning of the operation to flow more than 750 or 1,000 gallons a minute consistently for the operation. And by the time tankers do get there to be able to support that type of flow, I probably have enough equipment and time to build a second intake into my operation and twin tube draft and get a higher flow rate anyway. The front intake is for fast water with minimal equipment and to get the operation going so I can expand later. And to me, for a rural engine, really any engine, honestly, but particularly a rural engine, it's something that you really want to consider.
Bill, how about you? Rural pumper versus rural tanker?
I agree with Andy wholeheartedly as far as the intakes on the whole four sides, at least three. If you're looking for more flow and if you need that extra flow, maybe you can get the intake on the rear to where it's a more straight inlet, but then you got to maybe back into a source. Now you're getting stuck more often. One thing a lot of departments in this area started doing was buying basically one truck to replace two. And that's buying those, Andy mentioned the cost, the extra cost of getting a custom cab. But when instead of buying two apparatus, you can do that all in one. You're actually going to be saving some money by being able to get a custom cab where you can haul 6 firefighters plus the water you need, and replacing two apparatus with just that one. We're seeing that a lot around here, and anything over 1,800 gallon tanks usually come with a tandem axle. Manufacturers will tell you they can put on a tandem axle and still keep the shorter wheelbase. The second axle will be just further back, so you're not getting that big turning radius. We bought a tanker, and it's a commercial cab. And after we purchased it and got it in the station, we realized if we would have bought a commercial cab or a custom cab, that wheel it goes in behind the driver instead of sitting way out in front. And our turning radius on that particular tanker would have been much shorter than what we'd have on our commercial cab. So keep in mind on what type of roads you have in your area. If you have to make those tight turns, a custom cab. They even make 2-door custom cabs if you need be, if you don't want to get that extra cost. But keep that in mind. The turning radiuses can be very, very beneficial in a rural setting. As far as the engines go, a lot of times because we're having extra water, that 1,000 gallons instead of 500, it cuts into your compartment space. So we will usually have our hose bed be a tall hose bed instead of being a short hose bed. And to combat that issue, we'll take just a simple piece of webbing can go through that supply hose and hang off the back. And now our firefighters don't have to step up onto the tailboard to try to get the supply hose off the back of the rig. They can still stay on the ground, grab that webbing, pull that hose out. And by doing that, we are saving some compartment space. We're going to be able to still have enough compartment space to carry the equipment needed.
What about four-wheel drive? Is that, I have seen rigs with four-wheel drive. It does increase the height of the rig many times. How important is four-wheel drive going to be in the rural setting, Bill?
For around where I'm at, it's not necessary because I'm in flat area. But I have a good buddy of mine that's a firefighter in Colorado, and he's a rural setting. He's not wildland, but they have four-wheel drive because they have to have it. Up in Minnesota and northern Michigan, where they get a lot of snow, four-wheel drive can be very beneficial. Around, like I say, around my parts, it's not beneficial. It's not needed, I should say. But there are a lot of areas in the country that four-wheel drive could be beneficial.
Andy?
Yeah, so I think, again, I don't have too much experience operating a rig with four-wheel drive, a pumper that is. But I think, like Bill said, it's all based on your jurisdiction and your terrain. I know places here in East Tennessee that, Smoky Mountains, they're dealing with, wild grade changes. They deal with some snowfall that could be problematic. But the big thing that hopefully viewers understand is if you're putting four-wheel drive on your pumper, it's not necessarily so you can go off-road or off pavement with the vehicle like you may do with a pickup truck. The intention is that four-wheel drive is to help you and aid you when you're trying to go stay on the road, but you're dealing with challenging terrains, such as grades and slopes and snowfall and stuff like that. It's not necessarily to go off-road in a fire engine, just sheerly due to the weight.
Okay. So I mentioned in the beginning there are some challenges that are involved with designing these rigs. Andy, you talked a little bit about these with the rural pumper design, but what are some of the rural challenges besides securing a water supply that need to be considered when designing a rig for these environments? Andy, I'll start with you on that one.
So some rural challenges that you need to consider is one of the biggest rural challenges in my mind with regards to water supply is how are we going to access the water, right? And being able to reach a water source. So to me, that this first requires a department to do a needs assessment on not only the department and the apparatus they're replacing, but on their first due or their second due or wherever they may be using this rig. And if they have water sources that have the adequate amount of water to be utilized, but access is an issue, making sure that the rig is built and designed to carry enough hard sleeve or other devices, water inducting devices, to be able to reach that water source. Because in my mind, most of the time in our rural settings, right, we're an all hazards department. I understand that, but a rural engine is typically either pumping water to put a fire out or getting water to pump to a tanker to bring to the fire scene to put fire out. So being able to access and get water and pump water efficiently and successfully is one of the key pillars to that should be revolved around the whole spec process. So having and spec'ing the rig to be able to carry the necessary equipment for access issues or getting water from various places is absolutely paramount.
Bill, what about you? Anything to add to that, to what Andy said about the water, or anything beyond securing a water supply that people should be concerned about when designing these?
The biggest challenge I come with in the rural setting is personnel, not having enough. Where at work, I know that I've got 31 firefighters at least coming to the fire. In a rural setting, you may be one person. There's a lot of departments I've talked to in the country that they respond with one, and everybody else brings their POVs, and who knows how long that may be. So when I design an apparatus, or when I help in a department design an apparatus, I set it up for one person to be able to operate, whether it be pulling the line off by themselves, setting up their water supply by themselves, pulling off a dump tank by themselves. So having everything simple and ready when you don't have the manpower to get a bunch of firefighters to do these operations. Set everything up very easy for one operator.
Andy, that brings back your chafing block again.
Absolutely.
We're getting a lot of mileage out of that chafing block.
That chafing block is king.
It really is.
We talked about equipment in a previous podcast, but whenever we talk about designing a rig, we need to keep in mind the type of equipment also that we are designing it for. Bill just brought up having it set up so that a single operator can get everything moving, can stretch the line if necessary, can secure a water supply if necessary. And a lot of that does come to equipment mounting, equipment location. Bill was talking about the webbing on the supply line a little while ago. So just to refresh the audience's memory, what are some of we don't have to dive down into the entire previous podcast because people can go back to that. But what are some of those must-have items that they need to be thinking about and that they need to be thinking about securing on a rural rig? Bill, I'll start with you. What are some of those equipment items?
Yeah, something I've mentioned before. It all depends on what your operations consist of. If it's a nurse tanker, you're going to want to make sure that you have the equipment needed for that nurse tanker operation. One big thing I've found over the years is not having enough adapters. As mutual aid companies come in, it's very disturbing when they show up and I don't have the adapter to, hook up from their truck. They have water sitting there, but we have no way of getting it to my truck. So having the adapters, contact your mutual aid companies and find out what type of supply hose they use, what type of fire attack, what type of equipment do they use so that you have the right equipment on your rig for when they show up. We can't always count on them to have that. So if it's our fire, we need to make sure we have those adapters. It's worth its weight in gold to have them all yourself, because they may not have them themselves. They only got what they needed.
Andy, how about you? What are some of those must-have items that they need to think about how they're going to design into the rig, where they're going to keep that? You talked about hard sleeve earlier. What are some other things that they're going to need to think about? We need a compartment this size. We need to be thinking about how we're going to mount it. And, of course, so that one person can deploy all this stuff.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is critically important when almost equally, if identifying what the mission of the rig is the number one priority, the number two thing that needs to be discussed and figured out and hammered out before a committee even looks at specs or talks to an apparatus manufacturer is come up with a list of the equipment that are must-haves and things that need to be carried on the rig. Because your apparatus manufacturer can build the truck around the equipment. Too often I've been around fire departments or been a member of a committee and learned the hard way where we build a truck and then try and put the equipment on the truck we built rather than figuring out what we want to carry and building the truck around that equipment. And that really, you're going to build a much better truck that you're going to be much happier with if you follow that process. So along with that, right, we, like you said, we talked about hard sleeve. Bill hit the nail on the head with the adapters. That's critically important. But some other things that you want to be thinking about is what appliances, right? Are you carrying manifolds or clappered siameses? Are you in an area that also runs some hydrants and you might need a four-way valve? Are you dealing with those water thieves or manifolds or stuff like that? And those things are there have been improvements made to weight and size and everything, but they still can be awkward and rather heavy on your rig. So make sure you think about where they're going to sit on the rig and be able to be easily deployed. One of the things that I like to try and tell people, or whenever I'm laying a compartment out, is put that heavy stuff down low where it's easy to get, right? So those water thieves, those manifolds, those four-way valves, put them on the bottom shelf so that way one person can easily deploy them. If your department considers water educting devices like the turbo draft, one thing that I tell people, that thing is a great tool, but it is awkward and gangly to try and manipulate. They are rather heavy. Some fire departments will put them in the dunnage area of the rig, and I think that's one of the worst places to put the turbo draft, and it almost guarantees that you will not deploy it off the truck because it is just too difficult and awkward and dangerous for one person to deploy it. That's something that either needs to be mounted in a compartment or mounted on a step, or I've seen some fire departments mounted on the side of the pump panel, right? There are options available, but think about where these pieces of equipment need to be mounted.
Before we wrap up, I just have one more question. It's come up a few times, but I wanted to dive a little deeper into it. Talk about the maneuverability for these rigs. When we just talked about having them be combining two trucks into one, which will often require maybe a tandem axle, depending on how much water you are carrying and how many people, et cetera. But talk about that maneuverability. Also, let's also not forget about the angles of departure and things like that. But and that figures into maneuverability. Any suggestions that you guys have for Andy? I'll start with you for how to maximize the maneuverability of these for the rural setting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know some departments that I've consulted with and talked with. They can be a little hesitant to go to a tandem axle tanker or pumper tanker or stuff like that because they're concerned about maneuverability. And that is something that you definitely have to think about. But for me, when it comes to mobile water supply apparatus, I almost personally always like to spec that tandem axle. And especially if it is, I've looked at some drawings with one fire department that was debating tandem versus single. And really, they think that the single axle will be more maneuverable because, it's one axle and shorter and all this, that, and the other. But in reality, when we compared apples to apples and looked at drawings, the wheelbase of the tandem axle actually was smaller than the wheelbase of the single axle because the single axle had to be further back on the chassis in order for it to, balance the weight out appropriately and have all that stuff. So for that department, the tandem axle truck was going to be more maneuverable. But to me, there are other advantages of that tandem axle, especially in areas that have hills or grades and slopes and stuff like that. In the wintertime, it gives you more traction. Your tandem axle trucks are going to come with an interaxle differential, which is going to help you with the potential of getting stuck and stuff like that. So not to mention, it's going to allow you to balance out some of that weight a little bit more. And going from a tandem axle or a single axle to the tandem, some of your manufacturers may only put 1,800 gallons of water on a single axle. Others might go a little bit more, but that's apparatus specific. But if we just use 1,800 gallons, as that starting point, if I go to a tandem axle, I easily can get 2 or 25 or maybe even 3 without, negatively impacting the rest of the truck in a dimension-wise way, right? The other thing that I would recommend is be very conscientious about how tall these rigs get. They can get tall very quickly, and in the rural setting, that height can be problematic, not only because of rollover potential, but for me, I would much rather drive a truck that's longer than a truck that's too tall, because I can maneuver a long truck into a driveway or something like that. I might have to do a K-turn or do multiple maneuvers, but if the truck is too tall and can't get underneath something, then I cannot get it there, right? I can work with length. I can't work with height.
Bill, how about you?
Yeah. So what's the most statistically, tankers are the ones who wreck the most. They're always the most top heavy. They're the heaviest. Rural rigs are usually heavier than the urban rigs because they're hauling that extra water. So my comment is to be more careful with it. we, as volunteers, we don't drive these apparatus every day. So you got to really pay attention to the maneuverability of these trucks. And I agree with Andy with the whole tandem axle. A tandem axle gives you 2 more sets of brakes as well. So it helps you in those situations where you need that extra braking power. Like he said, extra traction. I'm a huge component of or fan of the tandem axle, anything over 1,800 gallons a minute.
Okay, well, that about wraps this up. Bill, do you have any general comments about what we've talked about today?
Just being more careful out there when driving these apparatus, and set your truck up what makes your operation, whether it be urban or rural. I know we're talking about rural here today, but even in your urban settings, set those trucks up for easily deployment with one operator, so that your other firefighters, even if you do have those 4 or 5 operators or firefighters on that rig, they can go do their job so that you can do yours.
Andy, how about you? Any general comments about what we discussed today?
Yeah, one thing that we didn't touch on too much that I think is important is, especially on the tankers, dump sizes matter, and making sure that you spec your dump chutes and everything appropriately. Where possible, the recommendation is to go to a square dump versus a round dump, because the square dump is going to offload more because there's more area compared to your round dump. You might need to go to a bigger round dump to get the same volume as your square. Something else that I tell folks that you should consider when it comes to dumping is consider over engineering or oversizing your tank vent on your tanker, because that is going to allow your truck to offload faster, because it allows more air in through the vent during the offload process. So you can exceed your NFPA recommendation of an average of 1,000 gallons a minute for 90% of the tank load. So that's another recommendation that I tell folks. And the other thing with dumps, if you're going electric or pneumatic and doing everything from the cab, which is really advantageous because you don't have to put anybody at the back or anything like that. What I recommend folks do is make sure that you put a manual override for when your pneumatics or your electric valves fail. I've been on incidents where that is the case, and it really sucks when there's no manual override to overcome that. So those to me are a must-have.
And my 2 cents basically is we when we talked a little bit about the adapters, make sure that when you are speccing that rig, there are a number of mounting options today for adapters, and there is nothing worse, at least as far as I'm concerned, as a pump operator, than when you've got two hose ends that you got to connect together, and you cannot find that one adapter that you're looking for. Forget about 2:00 in the morning and stuff. This can happen at 2:00 in the afternoon, where if they're not organized well, that will trip you up. The other thing, and I can't say this enough, just about the current environment, is if you are thinking about, no matter what you're doing, urban, rural, whatever, make sure that you are that you're starting. If you had planned on replacing one of these soon, you want to. It's like Ricky Riley always says: buy it now. As soon as you got the money, buy it now, because we are still looking at some of those lead times. But with all of that, Bill and Andy, thank you very much for joining me again today and talking rigs this time more than equipment. I know I probably got a little bit away from where we've been going before, whenever we've been talking about water supply and some of the equipment and stuff. But this is an important topic. There are certainly more rural districts out there, I think, than urban districts. So we do need to make sure that we're talking about this as well, because these rigs, although they're mission based and all that, the mission is almost the same, but executing to achieve the goal is what might be a little different when you get to the rural side. So thank you very much for taking some time out. If you have a topic that Andy and Bill have not touched on yet that you'd like them to, let me know. I'm at chris.mcloone@clarionevents.com. Also, if you want to see an archive of our podcasts, they are at fireapparatusmagazine.com/podcast. So again, my thanks to Bill and Andy today. Again, this has been Chris Mc Loone with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Have a good one and stay safe. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.